Good morning. My name is Doris Meissner, and I'm a Senior Fellow and Director of U.S. Policy Programs at the Migration Policy Institute. And I'm most pleased to welcome everybody this morning to this webinar, which we're calling A Bumpy Path to U.S. Citizenship, a survey of changing USCIS practices. We're going to begin, of course, with housekeeping notes. The first is that if you have any technical problems, please email to events@migrationpolicy.org or call 202-266-1929. Next, we have a Q&A that will be at the end of this call, but it's not going to be a voice Q&A. So please type your questions into the Q&A chat box on the right side of your screen and send them to the host or to email questions events@migrationpolicy.org. You can also tweet your questions to @migrationpolicy or #MPI discuss. The audio from today's webinar will be available at www.migrationpolicy.org/events. And then the report that we're discussing today is available on our website or at a link that is on your screen. The title is A Rockier Road to U.S. Citizenship? Findings of a Survey on Changing Naturalization Procedures. The co-authors are Randy Capps and Carlos Echeverria Estrada. Now let me turn to introducing our guests today, the first of whom is Randy Capps, co-author, primary author of the report, and also the Director of Research for U.S. Programs at the Migration Policy Institute. We're also joined by Eric Cohen, who is Executive Director of the Immigrant Legal Resources Center, ILRC, based in San Francisco. And finally, Leon Rodriguez, who is a partner at the law firm Seyfarth and formerly the Director of U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, USCIS, the agency that we'll be talking about to some extent today. So before we get into actually talking about the report and turning to the guests who I've just introduced, let me give you just a little bit of context for understanding what it is that we're going to be dealing with today. We all know that over the past several years, we have been living a time of exceptional levels of attention by this administration and changes being made to immigration policy. Those changes have touched every aspect of our immigration system, but I think it's fair to say that the focus heavily of the changes and public awareness of the changes has been more with regard to the work of CBP, Customs and Border Protection, and ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and on enforcement issues in general than on other aspects of immigration policy. But the changes that have been taking place have broadly affected all parts of the immigration service and in other areas that are also highly consequential. Our topic today is an example of some of those other kinds of changes and the broad reach of the changes that have been taking place in recent years. What we're talking about today is naturalization, which is the process by which those who are eligible to become U.S. citizens can become U.S. citizens. The work of naturalization is carried out by USCIS, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, which is the agency within the Department of Homeland Security, whose mission is to administer the legal immigration system. As it happens, it's especially relevant to be talking right now about the work of USCIS because we're in a moment where understanding the developments that have taken place at USCIS are really rising into view because of a severe budget shortfall that the agency is facing. And the shortfall is sufficiently acute that USCIS has announced a few weeks ago the possibility of furloughing more than 60% of its workforce. That would mean about 13,000 employees out of a staff of about 19,000. And that would happen if Congress does not step in and appropriate sufficient funding to close the gap between its revenue and its expenses. Were that to happen, it would only deepen and intensify trends that today's naturalization report identifies and that we'll be discussing in this hour that we're now launching, and the report that we're now launching. So with that, let me move to the speakers and begin with Randy Capps, who will lay out the research and talk about its findings.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar today. And many thanks to Doris for that comprehensive introduction. I would like to begin by thanking my co-author on this report, Carlos Echeverria Estrada, and also to thank Eric Cohen, who's the director of the Immigrant Legal Resource Center and on the call today, as well as Melissa Rogers and Sarah Letson for managing the survey that underlies the findings I'm going to discuss in a moment. Need to also thank the New Americans Campaign naturalization service providers who responded to the survey, as well as the communications team at MPI that brought the report to publication and facilitated this webinar. So by way of background, we've seen an increase in the amount of time it takes to process citizenship applications over the last few years, from 5 months in 2012, slightly upwards to 6 months in 2016, then nearly doubling to 10 months in 2018 and 2019. There was a bit of progress in reducing this backlog in the first 6 months of this fiscal year through March 2020, but that was before the pandemic hit. Now, people have mentioned several reasons why this increased backlog and processing time might be occurring. Part of it is that there were more applications filed during 2016 and 2017. There was a bump in those. Another reason is that there was an ongoing attempt to transform the whole processing system at USCIS from paper forms to an electronic system that failed and threw a wrench into the process during 2018 and 2019. There was also some detailing of staff away from naturalization and other activities to the border during the large wave of border asylum applications in 2018 and 2019, as well as some detailing of staff to new green card in-person applications, in-person interviews that were required for green card applications during 2018. So a number of factors really influence this increase in processing time, but the one we're going to focus on today, where there's been growing anecdotal evidence, but we have something a little bit more systematic to discuss, is the increased intensive vetting of applications and the focus on fraud detection and prevention. And that's been something a little bit new under this administration. So underlying today's findings is a survey of 110 naturalization service providers. These providers are part of this New Americans Campaign. That's a diverse, nonpartisan network of 200 agencies that have assisted almost 500,000 people apply for citizenship. The 110 service providers included in the study cover 34 metropolitan areas, so it's a nationwide survey, and they assisted applications sent to 52 of the 87 U.S. field offices across the country. The survey was conducted in the middle of last year, and it asked questions about what had changed 18 months to 2 years before the survey, in other words, basically since the beginning of the Trump administration. Topics included how much scrutiny applications were given, documents required, how USCIS officers conducted themselves. The questions were about different stages of the process, including before the interviews, during the interviews and tests, requests for evidence, and at the oath ceremony at the end. Finally, the questions were developed in consultation with the service providers. So what are the findings? Well, a quarter of the surveyed providers reported before the interview that clients missed those interviews due to late notices and notices sent to wrong addresses. And this has been a long-standing issue at USCIS and DHS more generally, but something that had occurred more frequently in the last year and a half and 2 months, 2 years prior to the survey. A quarter of respondents also reported that interviews had doubled in length from 20 to 30 minutes to 45 to 60 minutes, And in 3 offices, they were up to 90 minutes or more. Additional documents were required, and this included documents from state and local agencies such as motor vehicle administrations and police departments, as well as in some cases documents that were difficult to obtain from home countries. A third of respondents reported more requests for evidence. These RFEs are formal requests to fill in gaps in applications or gaps in information provided in interviews with additional documents or written responses. About 10% of providers reported that officers administered the test more strictly, and another 10% reported that officers had called back people more frequently for additional testing. So here's just one example of what a provider said about how USCIS officers are applying more scrutiny. Officers ask leading questions that are unrelated to eligibility. The intent is for denials. In represented cases, we end the interview. But for pro se applicants, that's for those that lack legal representation, they inform us that the officers just dig for information until satisfied. And this quote also shows the importance of having a representative, a legal representative, who can push back when USCIS is asking more intensive questions. Another couple of examples, one provider noted that officers were asking more questions about, in fact, in some cases, re-adjudicating old asylum claims. One elderly client who had a particularly traumatic asylum story was asked probing and detailed questions about her asylum case. The client broke down during the interview and was told she did not pass. A second interview was scheduled. A third service provider reported that an officer asked a technical question and then asked the respondent the applicant to explain it and reword it. Have you ever considered yourself a non-U.S. resident on any local, state, or federal tax return since you became a lawful permanent resident? Now, this is a yes or no question, but when asked to clarify and explain what the terms meant in the question, the applicant couldn't do it and was called back for another interview. This slide summarizes among the 52 offices included in this study how many offices had reported changes in the process and what the issues and the obstacles were substantively. So about half, 27 of the offices, there were reported increases in requests for proof of marriage or child support. In about a third of the offices, there were changes in asking more information about physical presence and continuous residency. Also in a third of offices, criminal records and good moral character. And you can see here listed some of the other common issues that arose. In the case of marriage and child support, there were more questions about underlying green card applications, with officers asking things sometimes going back years to the actual marriage ceremony and who attended and pictures of the wedding, et cetera. More proof of joint tax returns, bank statements, insurance bills, and other documents. As far as physical presence and continuous residency were concerned, there were questions, detailed questions about travel history, including the exact number of days traveled and exact travel dates, how people were able to afford to travel if they were low income, and in one case, if they had ever returned to their home country at all, which was going far beyond the statutory requirement. Now, under criminal history and good moral character, just after this survey was fielded, USCIS officially adopted a stricter definition of good moral character that was also related to an attorney general opinion about removal cases. In the case of this survey, USCIS officers were already asking for more questions about criminal history before the 5-year statutory period, 3 years in the case of those married U.S. citizens, for minor crimes, and minor crimes such as traffic tickets, driving under the influence, and in some cases, asking people for documentation that they had paid traffic tickets from 15, 20 years before the interview. So in conclusion, USCIS has changed its mission to emphasize more intensive vetting and fraud detection. And this survey suggests that this has led officers to exercise more scrutiny of citizenship applications. This more intensive vetting means it takes longer to process each application. It's expensive for USCIS, and it has increased the backlog. And it may further confound the application process during the pandemic, which is already in disarray. And of course, with the furloughs, it could get worse. The scrutiny, in this survey, scrutiny was frequently applied in areas that reflect the administration's overall immigration agenda. That is questioning family relationships, and we know that the administration's on the record in supporting limitations on who can get a green card through family ties. A greater emphasis on criminal history, no matter how minor, and this is very parallel to ICE's much more sweeping priorities for enforcement that includes people arrested for many minor crimes, and relitigating asylum claims. And of course, we know that this administration has expressed hostility towards asylum applicants in a number of ways, including official policies. Scrutiny was common across the 52 USCIS offices included in the study, suggesting that this is a change in the agency's culture and mission and the instructions given to adjudicators rather than their individual conduct or discretion. Finally, of course, these hurdles could deter future citizenship applications. They have made the process more difficult alongside the proposed fee increase in September, the possible furlough, and pandemic-related office closings. It could lead to a lot fewer people becoming citizens over the next months and years. Thank you.
Okay, Randy, thanks very, very much. So we're going to turn now to Eric. And let me thank you, Eric, on behalf of MPI for asking us to do the analysis on the survey and the data that you collected. Tell us more about your network and the reasons for the survey and what you make of it.
Great. Thank you so much, Doris, and thank you to Randy and Carlos and the rest of the MPI team for writing this extremely important report. As Doris said, my name is Eric Cohen. I'm the Executive Director of the Immigrant Legal Resource Center. I'm also an attorney, and for approximately 30 years, I've helped thousands of people go through this naturalization process, and I've really never seen the hurdles that this administration has been putting up. Never seen that in my 30 plus years of practice. So just a little background about the New Americans campaign and the survey and kind of our thoughts about what's going on. The ILRC leads the New Americans campaign, or we call it the NAC, which is the biggest naturalization collaboration in the history of the United States, working with approximately 200 partners in 21 cities from New York to Miami to Houston to Los Angeles. As this wonderful report notes, the NAC has helped over 470,000 people across the United States complete their naturalization applications. And the ILRC and its NAC partners provide naturalization assistance for free or minimal cost, meaning we're uniquely positioned to understand how changes to the USCIS adjudication process impacts immigrants across the country, especially those coming from low to moderate income families. Obviously, we're committed to this work because American citizenship is so valuable and important. In the United States, citizens can vote in federal elections, serve in certain offices, and cannot be lawfully deported from or denied entry into the United States. It's never been easy to become a citizen through naturalization. The process is long and rigorous, and the list of eligibility requirements are very extensive. The application for citizenship is now 20 pages long and extremely complex. Every applicant has already gone through extreme vetting in order to first obtain their green card and has to wait 3 to 5 years before becoming eligible even to apply for naturalization. During the naturalization process, all applicants have to get fingerprinted, which includes extensive background checks. And unfortunately, right now, our nation's naturalization program is in a state of dysfunction, and USCIS is not adequately, fairly, or efficiently processing naturalization applications. Instead of remedying this situation, the administration's policy has exacerbated unmanageable backlogs of nearly 650,000 applicants. The wait to naturalize has ballooned in some jurisdictions to 18 to 36 months, which are unacceptable levels, and the result is that naturalization applicants and their families are suffering. So I want to address Doris's question about why we did the survey, how we did it, and what our intent was. So since the beginning of this administration, the ILRC and our NAC partners have been observing a trend of USCIS manipulating the naturalization process to make it harder for immigrants to become citizens, throwing more and more hurdles at the process, as this wonderful report shows. The process was becoming more difficult, more time intensive, and far more burdensome for many immigrants that were seeking to gain their citizenship rights. We were noticing this with our 200 partners across the United States. And as we witnessed the ballooning backlog, super vetting processes, and significantly longer interviews, we wanted to find out from our partners across the country what they were seeing on the ground. Was this a pattern in practice or just a few random observations? Well, after we did the survey, we contacted MPI and asked them to do a report. And as the report points out, this is no anomaly. It's pretty much the norm. And for what gain? None whatsoever. Randy gave this wonderful example of how an Iranian woman applied for naturalization, and during the interview, the USCIS adjudicator decided to revisit the details of her asylum case, including the trauma she suffered in Iran. And even though those details were vetted during her asylum interview 9 years later, she broke down, as Randy said, and was unable to complete the interview, causing her to be denied. In another case, an adjudicator asked for proof of marriage even though the couple has children together, and the marriage was already determined valid by USCIS during the green card application interview. These are instances of where they're using precious resources to re-engage, to vet the individuals rather than to interview to see if they're eligible for naturalization. Essentially, the Trump administration has justified its transformation of USCIS from a benefits agency with a mission of customer service into an enforcement agency with a focus on extreme vetting based on wildly exaggerated ideas about rampant fraud in the naturalization process. The data does not support this conclusion. USCIS continues to approve the overwhelming majority of applications and has yet to produce any evidence of widespread fraud. Now, I want to note two important findings. The report has many, but two in particular. One that Randy mentioned about the doubling or tripling in length sometimes of the interview process. That is unnecessary and not needed in order to adjudicate these applications. And the other is how much more difficult the English exams are, and how much more time that takes, and how much more fear that puts in the applicant. So those are two instances of the report notes. It's important to note the U.S. Constitution requires Congress to establish a uniform rule for naturalization, which the executive must oversee and administer. What we are seeing goes far beyond providing strong oversight and good government, however. These trends can only be interpreted as a politicalization of naturalization itself from a federal government that is doing its best to intimidate and discourage immigrants seeking to naturalize. Naturalization is a nonpartisan or bipartisan both issue. You know, I've told this story before, but I'm going to tell it again. In 2013, I was fortunate enough to be invited to speak on a panel at George W. Bush's Presidential Library in Dallas. I believe it was one of the first, if not the first, public event at the Presidential Library. The event's focus was on naturalization and included a naturalization swearing-in ceremony at which President George W. Bush gave a really wonderful speech. At one powerful moment in the speech, which made quite an impact on me, President Bush told the soon-to-be American citizens, and I quote, "In a few moments, we will share the same title, a title that has meant more to me than any other, and I've had a lot, and that title would be Citizen of the United States." Thank you, Doris.
The examples that you give are certainly very moving, and naturalization is one of those issues that really does, I think, when anybody experiences it, participates in a ceremony, et cetera, something that is so uniquely American and very much one that is, you know, goes to the core of our values and our value system. But, you know, when you're responsible for a large agency and have to manage the operations of complex processes like naturalization along with everything else, there are always going to be those very compelling stories. At the end of the day, the job of the agency is to do it as well as it can, but it's never going to get it right every single time. So in order to try to step back now from that very direct, compelling view of what happens to people to what is it like really to try to administer an agency that has to take that into account, but also has to make choices and do its work. We're very pleased to be able to hear from Leon Rodriguez, who did run this agency with all of its challenges. And so, Leon, could you do that? Could you step back, tell us what your reactions are to this particular set of issues that has to do with naturalization, how you experienced the naturalization mandates and process at USCIS, and then, you know, talk to us more broadly about USCIS as an agency, its challenges, and particularly what it's facing right now.
Great. Excuse me. Thanks, Doris, for inviting me here today, and thank you, Randy and Mr. Echevarria for the report, and Eric for really placing this all in the context of everyday practice with aspiring U.S. citizens. I want to actually start by saying hello to what I believe to be a number of USCIS employees who are on the call today. I know that this is a time when the agency is going through some real uncertainty. I've spoken to a number of you. There's a lot of anxiety about the budgetary situation. One of the things that I really liked to do when I was USCIS director was to meet the workforce, was to travel to field offices, sit with officers as they were conducting interviews. And one thing that I particularly remember was actually going to Charleston at the USCIS Academy and participating in a graduation. And I remember the admonition of one of the head instructors at the Academy to the then graduating class was that the fundamental principle of being a USCIS officer was the right benefit to the right person at the right time. And what's important about that is that has always been the culture of USCIS. This isn't something that had to be built in 2017 because it didn't exist before. It was something that was very much deeply ingrained in how officers operated. It was very much my perception. And so as we talk about, you know, is it necessary to do all of these? Ask the kinds of questions that Eric was describing specifically and that were sort of captured more globally in Randy's report. The fact is that the workforce knew how to properly vet candidates, be it for citizenship or for any other immigration benefit, long before all of the changes that we've seen in the last 3 years. And so, you know, there's a question, really fundamental question, as to whether all of these added burdens were necessary, and a question as to whether those same added burdens have led to the financial crisis now facing the agency. But let me take some personal responsibility here before we go further. Cycle times have been a chronic issue at USCIS throughout its entire existence. And, you know, when you choose to emphasize one particular line of activity, it is inevitable that another line of activity may suffer. So, for example, we actually, you know, you'll see the trend line, you know, 2016, there's a sort of a slight step up in cycle times during 2016. That would have been under my leadership. And then there's sort of a sharp upsurge in 2017. The fact was that even in 2016, the kinds of increases in cycle times that we were seeing then was something that was drawing, rightfully so, drawing concern and criticism from all kinds of quarters. And so, I want to be clear that as we talk about how things have gotten, significantly worse since my time as director, we have to own the fact that they weren't perfect back then. That said, what we're seeing right now is fundamentally different. And what I also have to emphasize is that what we're seeing with respect to naturalization are issues that are being endured across categories of activity at USCIS. So the kinds of increases in wait times for naturalization are being seen as well in green card adjudications. They're being seen in all kinds of non-immigrant categories. It's affecting asylum adjudications. So it's being seen throughout the agency. And the question that has to be asked and that has to really be understood with some real detail is what is the impact of a number of conscious decisions that not just the leadership of the agency, but really the political leadership all the way up to the top that sits over that agency, conscious decisions that have been made, what is the degree to which those have caused, one, the inefficiency of these very, very long wait times, but also then more as profoundly the financial crisis that we're seeing right now. So, as we've talked about, I think, Randy and Eric talked about some of the examples of what we've been seeing. Requests for evidence have been documented to have increased dramatically during this time. We have to break down what that means. If you write a request for evidence, that's officer time that's consumed in writing that request for evidence. When you get back to the answer, and we send these out from my law firm every single day, they could be between 500 and 1,000 pages each. Those 500 and 1,000 pages need to be read. That's additional officer time that's being confused. When you increase the ways in which cases can be denied, which is something that has been happened, that needs to be documented, that needs to be justified. And that too increases officer effort. So these are examples. The use of interviews for employment-based adjustment interviews. Are those really necessary? Do they improve the integrity of the system? Do they really safeguard our national security? That's a fair question to discuss. But the reality is that they add to the activity the agency is doing. And what needs to be asked now by Congress is, what planning went in when you added all these burdens to the agency? What planning went in as you did that, as to what all of the impact is going to be? And one thing that I would note as far as a lot of these changes is the administration keeps losing in court. They keep getting challenged both on a global basis as to these policy changes, individually in a number of cases, and they keep routinely losing in court on these issues. So the one of the questions is this unusual for USCIS? Or is it somehow inherent in the way that USCIS is financed? And to step back for a second here to understand, USCIS, about 90% of its budget is fee funded. It's paid for by immigrants or aspiring immigrants who are seeking, whether it be a non-immigrant visa, they're seeking a green card, they're seeking naturalization as U.S. citizenship, U.S. citizens. It comes from the fees that they pay. And they're like a number of other benefit granting agencies that also charge fees. If you go apply for a driver's license, you pay a fee. If you want a permit to build an extension on your house, you pay a fee. So there's nothing inherently wrong with the fee model. The question, though, is what are you actually getting for that fee? Is that fee, and are you delivering the service as efficiently and fairly as you can, or are you sort of adding burdens to the system that are unnecessary? But there's something about the fee model that does breed a certain, it hasn't, breed a certain amount of efficiency into the system because, you're bound by what you're able to charge for the service that you're providing. Now, what's happened is that for years, and this goes back through the Obama administration, goes back to the Bush administration, USCIS by design ran an annual surplus. In the most recent years before this sudden reversal, it was a surplus going into each new fiscal year of between $600 and $800 million. That is now flipped to be a deficit of or at least a budget request to Congress of $1.2 billion. And again, it's hard to really attribute that only to the decline in receipts because of the corona pandemic, and it leads to really asking real questions as to what burdens are being imposed on the system and what is the justification for those burdens. And one of the things that you'll hear is there a threat of fraud? And as much as any other activity where a person's whole life depends on the outcome of what they're seeking, certainly USCIS is vulnerable to fraud. Has there been fraud in the past? Absolutely. You know how we know that? Because the system actually caught it. The system, well before all of these added burdens that you heard Randy and Eric talk about, actually had mechanisms in place, had them for years to actually detect and capture fraud, including the training of the officers who with experience became very effective without a lot of gratuitous questions, as we heard described by Eric, at finding fraud. So, is there this need to sort of vastly increase fraud fighting resources? That's a question that really needs to now be asked. Is all of these enhanced fraud fighting resources that have now been sort of added into the system, what are the results? What have they found? What has actually changed? Because one of the things that we have to take seriously is where is the fraud accusation coming from? If we were catching it effectively all along and policing it effectively all along, you have to wonder whether, in fact, fraud is being used as a proxy for a different, more broadly anti-immigrant agenda. And so a lot of the instructions that are now being given are these really the means of accomplishing this broader anti-immigrant agenda? I want to return for a second to the question about fee funding. There are activities that are not, where no revenue is collected by USCIS, in particular asylum processing and refugee activity. And I think one thing that needs to be discussed, I don't know the answer, but one thing that I think does need to be discussed is whether, in fact, those are activities that are part and parcel of our foreign policy, and that therefore are a collective responsibility of all of the American people, not just of USCIS fee payers. And that therefore, at least those areas of activity, perhaps it makes sense to consider having those be tax funded rather than fee funded. One question that's been asked is what's going to happen if there is a furlough at USCIS, and how would you prioritize among areas? I would say my understanding is that if that does happen, it's going to be sort of a straight line reduction in activity across all activity areas. That's something that I think could change. And I think that's, it's difficult to say that any one more activity. They're all important. Citizenship is of paramount importance. It was important to me. But the reality is that all of the activities are important, and there really should be a solution that funds them all. And I think what needs to go in line with that is real accountability. How is the money spent? Where did it go? What efforts have been made to really look at where the money went, and also where is it going to go in the future, to understand an economic model for USCIS going forward that's actually going to enable it to do to discharge its core mission in a way that is fiscally sound. So I think these are really challenging times. I think there's a lot of hard questions that need to be answered by the leaders of the agency. But I am also hoping that in short order, Congress will be able to help them and will set them on some sort of stable course for the future. Thanks, Doris.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Leon. We have questions coming in from a variety of places, so we'll get to as many of them as we can. But before we do so, I want to pick up on this point that you made, Leon, about processes that had been in place and about the agency's mission and efforts longstanding to protect the integrity of the process. Randy, could you review for us a point that I think is in the report that has to do overall with approval rates? In other words, we're essentially finding on naturalization much more process and procedure and therefore a slowing down. But at the end of the day, for all of that additional effort, has anything really changed where the approval rates are concerned over time on naturalization cases?
Thanks, Doris. I mean, I think that's an important finding from the report. And although, Eric has mentioned, and we include some examples in the report where there were denials, denials have been in a very tight range from about 88 to 92% over the past several years, including the first 6 months of fiscal 2020. So if they've come down, they've only come down a percentage point at 2. It means that the fraud detection and more intensive vetting is really not uncovering things that are leading to more denials. It's just creating more effort on the part of USCIS officers, as Leon mentioned, and much more burden and, making the process much scarier for the applying immigrants, as Eric mentioned.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to go to a question now. And let me see. I think that this is a question that perhaps you can answer, Randy, and perhaps Eric can pipe in. But it has to do with differences across USCIS offices. Is there any information that the practices across USCIS offices is considerably different? Are some more successful in processing during taking shorter amounts of time and interviews that are more to the core issues rather than these more excessive practices? Do we have any information on that?
Yes, I mean, clearly there are variations among offices. As we mentioned in the report, there were 3 offices in particular where the interview time was up to 90 minutes or more at some point during the study period, compared to among a certain percentage of them, an hour or so, and among others, it was still more like it had been historically at around half an hour. So if you just use the metric of the amount of time spent in the interview, there's quite a bit of variation. I don't have those statistics in front of me, but there's also variation in the backlogs by the average processing time, considerable variation in that by office. We did not systematically review that in terms of which offices and why. We didn't get inside information from USCIS on why there would be longer interviews, more intensive vetting, and longer backlogs in some offices than others. But yes, there's quite a bit of variation.
Okay, I have a question here that I think Leon we would want to ask you because you are the most likely to know the answer, and that is, what is the best way to interrogate the value proposition of the programs that have been implemented with the goal of reducing fraud? Is there, for example, a department or an office within the agency that does cost benefit analyses of those programs?
Yeah, there are offices within the agency itself, as well as DHS more broadly, that look at quality and performance in many different respects. I mean, the question in terms of fraud fighting efforts is what are they finding? And if the proposition is that the existing level of effort for fraud fighting pre-2017 was somehow missing meaningful fraud, then we should see 3.5 years later a significantly higher level of confirmed fraud cases. And when I say confirmed, meaning that once that individual challenges the finding, that it still stands. And I don't know that we've seen any real evidence of such a change. And also just generally looking at whether the denial of cases as a group is being based on fraud or other kinds of findings of ineligibility, and whether that's a really meaningful change. I think that's at least one indicator. I think there's a lot of factors that go into it, but that would at least be one indicator that you'd want to look at.
Okay, let me ask a question of probably Eric. You're probably in the best position to answer this question. Are there possibilities to dispute illegal denials to citizenship? If so, what's the process and the chances of overturning decisions?
Yeah, that's a great question. There is both an administrative appeal process. So when one is denied, they can administratively appeal it within the USCIS, and sometimes there are quite a few good results out of that. There often are more senior adjudicators handling those cases, and more seasoned, and oftentimes you can win, overturn the denial. And then if that's denied as well, then you can go to the United States Federal District Court in your jurisdiction. Very expensive in the sense you're going to have to get a lawyer, obviously, but you can go to a federal district court judge, and sometimes federal district court judges are really good about looking at all the factors and sometimes overturning the denial as well.
Okay, here's another question about something we've been reading about in the press, and I think perhaps you're in the best position again, Eric, to answer it, given your working directly on a day-to-day basis with this. It's about drive-through and wondering whether the drive-through naturalizations have made any dent in the pending cases. So what's the extent of drive-through naturalizations? Are these just spot circumstances, or is this a much more broadly based response that the agency is put into place right now to the virus issue?
Yeah, so the drive-through are all about the oath ceremony, which is the very last part of the naturalization process. You've already been adjudicated and interviewed and approved, and then it's a coronavirus response, actually. Then starting when the government shut down, there were accumulated between that time and the beginning of June, well over 100,000 people who had gone through the whole adjudication process, had been approved, but hadn't had the opportunity to actually been sworn in yet. And so the USCIS took most of June and are taking most of July, if not all of July, to try to clear that backlog of just the people who had already been approved, adjudicated and approved, and were awaiting just their swearing in ceremony. And they've done a couple of creative of projects, one of which is the drive-through oath ceremonies. Another is very small oath ceremonies, because usually they're several hundred people, and we don't want people getting the coronavirus, obviously. We think they could do more through virtual oath ceremonies, but so far they've done a pretty good job trying to clear up that specific backlog, which is about 110,000 people waiting for the oath. Meanwhile, there's a backlog of almost 700,000 people who are waiting to be adjudicated. So two different groups of people.
Exactly. Okay. Here's a question, Randy, that perhaps you can answer. Did the survey identify the extent to which stepped-up scrutiny applied equally to all applicants, or were there any observed variations in the treatment of applicants based on race, ethnicity, or national origin?
Yes. Now, unfortunately, since this is a survey of providers who assisted people with their applications, it's not a survey directly of the applicants themselves. We don't have that kind of demographic data, so we can't really talk about variations by race, ethnicity, or other demographic factors.
Okay, I'm going to move now, Leon, to a question that I think you can help answer, and it has to do, and from the standpoint of your own experience when you were there. Could you please discuss efforts to educate the general public on the value of immigration and the integrity of the USCIS system prior to these more excessive efforts?
Yeah, so USCIS engaged in a lot of different public education campaigns. Actually, citizenship promotion was a core priority for us, certainly in my time. And so we engaged in a lot of effort. You know, there was an Office of Citizenship, which I think still exists there. We gave citizenship grants to a number of organizations to both sort of promote the choice of U.S. citizenship and then also to support people who were, preparing to apply for, take the test, go through the process. So those have all been sort of a part of how USCIS operated. I will say something that I think, again, in all the prior directors, Doris, going back to your time in INS and even before, across parties, there's always really been a real strong belief in the value, and it's been part of how we presented ourselves as an agency, how we set up our websites, how we set up our materials, how we gave speeches. The idea that immigration is good for the United States. It's good economically, it's good culturally, it's good in so many different ways. And that's something that for years the agency was really able to effectively tell that story, even as it was doing its job of operating the system with integrity, which is important, is critical, that fraud be avoided, the national security be protected. But all of that can be done alongside of a real commitment to the importance of immigration, a robust immigration to the United States.
So let me pick up on that point, Leon, and ask you the question about the mission statement, because, there was early in the administration a formally made in the USCIS mission statement, and it dropped the terminology customer and providing customer service. And apparently there has been just a strong feeling among some when that mission statement change was made that the notion of customers is incorrect where USCIS's work is concerned. Can you comment on that? What are your thoughts about that? And what do you think that the formal change in the articulation of the mission statement may have to do with what we're seeing?
Yeah, no, I think that the change in articulation statement is based on this rhetorical line that the system, and I emphasize it was a rhetorical line, it's contrary to the actual evidence, that the system was operating in a way that favored, inappropriately favored those who were applying for benefits. That the idea of calling them customers would somehow predispose officers reviewing cases to sort of lean inappropriately in favor of granting those cases, of foregoing some kind of scrutiny. And that's just not true. And instead, what the word customer meant is that people needed to be treated fairly. They needed to be treated with a recognition of what a significant part of those individuals' lives the immigration process is. Whether it's citizenship, a green card, what have you, that is as big a day in your life as the day you get married, the day you graduate from college, possibly even bigger. It makes such a big difference in people's lives. And that as an agency, we respected the importance of those events in people's lives, even as we did our job of assuring the integrity of the system and of protecting the system from fraud. That whole notion, that whole view of sort of the nobility of aspiring to immigrate to the U.S. And the choice of becoming a U.S. citizen sort of jumped out the window with that mission statement, in my view.
Randy, I have a question for you that has to do with public charge. Is there any way to determine from the survey whether the change in public charge requirements, criteria, has affected naturalization?
Yeah, so it shouldn't, because the public charge rule applies to applicants for green cards, not to applicants for citizenship. People who already have a green card, it's called a public charge inadmissibility rule, which is basically inadmissibility for getting into the country or for adjusting status to a green card. Once people have the green card, the public charge rule by statute, by law, should not apply. So it shouldn't have any impact, and we didn't really uncover any evidence that it would have any impact on the citizenship process.
Okay, thanks. Eric, here's a question for you. Is the denial of a citizenship denial of an application for citizenship, how does it affect permanent resident status, if at all?
Well, that's a good question too. It depends on the reason for the denial. So if the denial is just because you didn't meet one of the requirements for citizenship, you remain a lawful permanent resident, and you can wait some time usually and reapply for naturalization when you're eligible again. If the denial is based on something because you're maybe deportable now, because you've committed some sort of crime or something, you're deportable, or the denial goes at whether or not you were originally eligible for your green card in the first place, then the USCIS might refer that case to the U.S. Immigration Customs Enforcement Agency, and they might decide to pursue a deportation case, a removal case against you. And you could end up losing your green card and being deported in some circumstances, which is a very scary, obviously, process. Well, you know, one thing I want to go back to real quickly, if I could, Doris, that I forgot to add, is that the USCIS did actually miss a really good opportunity to swear in those people those 100,000 people I talked about earlier who are going through drive-through ceremonies and small ceremonies. They could have, during the pandemic, tried some sort of virtual oath ceremonies in April and May, and maybe naturalize all those 100,000 people, and then starting in June, they could have started chipping away at the almost 700,000 backlog of naturalization applications. So I'd forgotten to add that, and thank you for letting me add that.
Well, I'm glad you added it, because the next question that I was going to come to had to do with virtual ceremonies. So it's been taken care of by your addressing it. Unfortunately, we're at the end of our time, and so there are some questions that we haven't been able to get to, for which we apologize, but we want to respect people's time and the announcement that we made about the duration. I want to thank the audience very much for tuning in, for sending us your questions. I want to particularly thank very much our guests today for talking about this report, for explaining more about the naturalization process, and for helping to shine a light on an area of immigration policy that is exceedingly important and that sometimes doesn't get the kind of attention that it deserves. So let me, for you in the audience, again draw your attention to the availability of the report. You can see how to get it by the link that is on your screen. It's also available on the MPI website, www.migrationpolicy.org. The slides and the audio from today's webinar are also available at that same website, www.migrationpolicy.org/events. That will be up as of tomorrow. And do please continue to visit our website for ongoing research and events and analysis that MPI puts out on an ongoing basis. For any reporters who were not able to get your questions answered, please feel free to call Michelle Middlestat at 202-266-1910. And with that, we'll close out today. Thank you very much.